Hi, this is Richard Milroy for Three Pillars Network in the bottom of your screen here. Welcome to our first vodcast. Today I'm interviewing the keynote speaker for our Behaviour Change Congress, which is happening in early November in Sydney. He has just written a fascinating book entitled Planet Obesity, How We Are Eating Ourselves and the Planet to Death. Garry Egger is Professor of Health and Human Sciences at Southern Cross University. He advises to the World Health Organization and others, and has a great deal of experience in this area. What is fascinating for us as behaviour change practitioners is two things, really. Gary's background in health and the behaviour change programs he will have been involved with and has been involved with, most famously Gutbusters and Mr. Trim, and also the link that Garry is making between health and ecology and the environment. And for us at Three Pillars Network, looking to create these links between social, environmental and economic sustainability, it's a classic and a perfect example for us as our keynote speaker, and that's why we've invited him. Hello Garry, and welcome.
Hello Richard.
So Garry, I've got heaps of possible questions for you, but I'll start with one. As I mentioned, your book is of great interest to Three Pillars Network members for those two reasons. One, your experience in behaviour change programs, and secondly, the link that you're making with ecology. Can we just start with the first of those and tell us a little bit about your background, Gutbusters and Professor Trim? I mean, I have to say I've got a personal interest because I've got those big love handles that I'm trying to get rid of, and I watched your video online with interest yesterday. I'm even thinking about signing up. So can you tell us a bit about the background and the behaviour change aspect of that?
Okay, my academic background originally started in psychology, and then I moved more into behavioural biology and epidemiology. So the psychology has sort of equipped me to deal with the behaviour change aspects of disease. Now, given that 70% of diseases these days are chronic diseases that are associated with the way people live and the environment that we live in, and that requires behaviour change, then that sort of background is quite useful when you combine it with the epidemiology, which is the causes of disease and the understanding of the causes of disease. So it's one thing to work out what causes the disease and then look at the distal causes, because you've got what we call the proximal causes, the immediate causes, the diet and the exercise and so on, that may lead on to things like obesity. But then you've got things that cause that. People don't eat too much just because they're born to eat too much. They eat too much because it's forced on them by the society that they live in, or because they are anxious or nervous or whatever. And you take those distal drivers further and further back till you find the cause of the cause of the cause. That's all of the causes. And in this case, the case of the book that we've just put out, we take that right back to the economic conditions and situation under which we live, and particularly the continual drive for unfettered economic growth, which has gone beyond what we call the sweet spot, so that you're starting to get negative returns from continued economic growth in the modern Western society.
Yeah, and look, this is a topic that we are very fond of at Three Pillars Network. Work like prosperity without growth that the UK Development Commission undertook, a Sustainable Development Commission undertook, and that sort of aspect. I mean, what I find fascinating from what you've just said, though, and what I'd like to ask you a bit more about is psychology. I mean, to implement a behaviour change program successfully, how much understanding or experience of psychology do you need?
Well, I think academic psychology is a bit of a waste as far as that goes. When you get down to the real nitty-gritty of how you change large populations, it comes down to experience and to, I guess, age, to a certain extent as well, and looking back and seeing what the major changes that have happened and how they've happened. And it's interesting that when you look at an epidemic like obesity, which is one of the biggest epidemics the world has ever seen, we have had no impact at all at a population level. And when I say we, I mean generally Western populations. There's really only 2 or 3 examples of reductions in obesity at the population level. Sure, individuals can do it. People can go out, provided they make up their mind that they really want to do it. You can lose weight at the individual level, but for a decrease in population and the epidemic at the population level, it's really only been Cuba after the Russians left and they went through an economic crisis.
Right.
Nauru, when they ran out of superphosphate and went through an economic crisis. And really, Karen O'Day's great example where she took Aboriginal people back into the bush and got them living on native taka. They're the only three examples. Otherwise, this epidemic just keeps getting bigger.
And from what you're saying there, there seems to be a very obvious link with economic prosperity and, you know, overconsumption, which is, of course, has so many other aspects to it than personal obesity. But would that be right?
Yeah, and this is where the ecological side of this comes into it. Unfortunately, health has been divorced from the ecological sciences and vice versa for a long time. And we tend to be becoming more and more specialised in our different silos, and that makes it difficult for economists to communicate with health specialists and doctors and surgeons and so on. And unfortunately, we need more and more of that type of communication rather than less and less. So what we're trying to do is to take that back and look not just at the ecological aspects, but the things that drive the ecological aspects. Climate change, for example, is a good example. Climate change is a good example. The causes of climate change and the causes of obesity, if you follow them back, are very similar.
So in other words, overconsumption, unfettered demand for resources, you know, the economic system to a large degree is what you're talking about at the end of the day.
Again, we have to be careful there, because there tends to be a notion by a lot of people, and particularly by the opposition to this type of change notion, that what we are criticising is the whole notion of economic growth.
Yeah.
And we're not doing that. Nobody who looks at the data would do that, because economic growth has been fantastic for humanity over the last 150 to 200 years. But any system that grows exponentially has to reach a point where it starts to achieve diminishing returns. And any economist knows what that means. You can't keep investing $1 and continue to get the returns on that dollar beyond a certain point. So it's beyond that. We think that it's beyond that point that we've gone now. And that point was around about the 1970s or 1980s in modern Western societies. And now we're starting to get the negative returns, which are showing up in things like climate change and our health, chronic diseases, and particularly obesity.
Fascinating. I mean, I think that also applies on a personal level. There's a certain level of wealth you get to if you go to sort of Maslow's pyramid of needs type analysis. Once you've got the roof over your head and the food you need to eat and good relationships and so on, then, you know, there ain't much else, I guess, at the end of the day, is what we're talking about. So how do you hope to change behaviour in terms of what people eat? Or tell us a bit about your experiences of having done it in programs you've run in the past.
The traditional ways of altering behaviour at population level is, first of all, to increase awareness. So that's a knowledge-based thing. And there is very little awareness of the notion of economic growth as being a health driver or an ill health driver in the community in general. You speak to the average Joe on the street and they think that economic growth is something that's been with humanity right for 200 and 300,000 years. And of course it hasn't. It's only been around since after the First World War and after the Major Depression. It started in the 19th century, but it really only took off after the Depression. So it's really only 100 years or so, or even less. And even the architects of that, such as J.M. Keynes and J.S. Mill and so on, said that we may have to have growth for perhaps up to 100 years, but after that we would have to look to the alternative, because nothing can grow forever. Growth beyond maturation is either obesity or cancer, which is a very apt description when we're looking at growth and health, economics and health.
So you can draw an analogy between the planet, as you refer to at the population, I mean the planet or communities, between doing this at the population level and the human body. It's interesting actually, in some of the three pillars events we hold, there's a lot of discussion about complexity theory and looking at systems as organic systems, and there's a lot of this analogy with the human body that seems to reoccur.
Well, even back to Lovelock's notion of Gaia, which is the Earth systems theory, basically. Lovelock sees the Earth as a living system, which adapts and changes to the impositions that are put on it. Now, that's a similar sort of approach to the individual health approach. But as I say, health scientists have got their head down, looking into the microscope in general, trying to work out the problems, the molecular problems of human health, rather than looking further back at the causes of those problems. Yeah. Now, we have to have both. We're not suggesting that you have one, not the other. We have to have both. But at the moment, we're really underweighted on the ecological and environmental side of health.
Mm-hmm. Okay. It's fascinating stuff. Do you have any, look, before we leave the interview, do you have any tips for other behaviour change practitioners? Because at the end of the day, we want to try and give our audience some practical guidelines of how they can implement behaviour change programs at the population level, as you say in your field. Do you have any classic do's and don'ts?
Well, certainly there's a structured change that you get in any form of behaviour change. As I said, increasing awareness is the first thing. Then you've got to increase motivation after awareness, and the motivation to act comes not just necessarily from what you do, but from what is imposed on the society as a whole. And one of the problems at the moment is that we're all living very comfortably, and there's very little motivation for people to make any significant change in their lifestyle, because the problems are future-oriented problems. But unless we act now, we're not going to get the changes that are going to make those changes in the environment occur. I think then the third point after that is reinforcement of the change. So you've motivated, you've got people to make the change, and the situation is right. And bear in mind that most population health change doesn't start a wave, it gets onto the wave after it's started rising. Yeah. So it pushes the wave along. So what you've got to do then is to try and reinforce that wave once it gets started, and come up with ways of making people continue to think about what they can do to make the situation better over the long term. Not to think, oh, I've done my bit, now I'm out of it, let's forget about it. But also to think on a broader scale, to think on a population level as well as on the general level.
I often think of the anti-smoking campaigns of the sort of 80s and 90s and how successful they've been in that regard. I mean, that seems to be a classic example. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would, because I was involved in those campaigns as well. But there are very significant differences, and the main one is that there's no level of smoking that's good for you. Whereas when we're talking about other aspects of lifestyle, such as diet and exercise and so on, there are various levels of those types of activities, some of which are recommended, and then extremes of which are not recommended. Even exercise, we're starting to realise now that with the extreme exercises, the ultramarathon as an example, it's just as bad as not exercising in the first place. You get this huge rise in inflammation in the body.
I did not need to be told that. I knew that from the day I was born, frankly. But anyway,
this is only extreme exercise. It's a U-shaped curve, unfortunately. I'm sorry to tell you.
I think for most mortals, running an ultramarathon is obviously a bad idea. But there you go. Anyway, look, it's great to talk to you, Garry, and I hope very much looking forward to hearing a lot more from you at our Congress in November, and thanks very much for your time today.
Okay, Richard, you're welcome.
Cheers, bye now.